where software quality lives, breathes, and keeps evolving.
Welcome back to the Quality Beat, the podcast where we talk about what truly drives quality in modern enterprise systems. I'm your host, Gurpreet, and today we're unpacking a topic that everyone claims to understand, but very few practice in a realistic way, and that is end-to-end testing. What actually counts as end-to-end? How real is your real environment? And why do so many end-to-end suites give us a false sense of confidence? To help us separate the myth from the reality, I'm joined by someone who's seen this from every angle, Christian, aka Chris. So welcome to the show.
Thanks, Gurpreet. I'm excited to be here. And you're so right that false confidence is the real killer of end-to-end tests.
Absolutely. I'm excited to dig into that today. And before we get into that, let's kick things up a notch with a quick fire round to warm up and get the energy flowing. So are you ready?
Let's do it.
Perfect. Okay, here we go. So just a short word, the short phrase or a word for each. What's your go-to testing tool?
Oh, that's Excel, but don't tell anyone.
I think I've heard of that one. Um, biggest testing pet peeve?
That's people that are using Excel as a test management tool, and I'm afraid that sometimes includes myself.
Okay. And favorite programming language to write tests in?
I think nowadays it's more like natural language that I use AI on to interpret it and to turn it into my test scripts.
Interesting. And what do you think is the most underrated aspect of end-to-end testing?
I think that a lot of people there are thinking that just because it works in testing, it will survive also in production.
Yeah, I think you're right there. Definitely. And finally, then, one thing you wish everyone understood about quality.
Quality doesn't mean finding bugs, it means creating value.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. And now that we're warmed up, let's get stuck in. So, if you had to define end-to-end in one sentence, what would you include and what would you exclude?
I think it's rather simple. End-to-end testing is just checking if a real business process actually works across different applications from one end to the other end. Most of the time, one end is somewhere in your ERP system or in your warehouse, and sometimes the other end is your end user clicking a buy button or something, but it's really just one business process. The problem that I see with this is that end-to-end is a little story we sometimes tell ourselves that we can rely on because in reality, most end-to-end suites have stubs, feature flags, fixed data, disabled integrations, so they are not even really end-to-end, and we have to consider that.
I see. Okay. And so in that context then, why would you say end-to-end testing is critical for enterprise level software systems?
I'm doing this since over 20 years now, and I've noticed one thing. In big enterprise system, there is not a single person that understands the whole architecture. I've talked to insurances, to banks, to huge retailers, and they all have a system that's so complex that not one person understands it. So we often have legacy mainframes, they talk to modern microservices, but we need to use end-to-end testing to figure out, is our tech stack still working? Does the new feature work end-to-end of how we want it to work? Because we
Mhm.
cannot predict that just looking at our system setup.
Right. And that so it all comes down to complex architectures then, you would say.
Absolutely. And um, also, there's this fallacy to think that there's just one end-to-end. Usually, I have so many different ends on each side. I think end-to-end simplifies it, to a very linear thing, but there
Hmm.
is so many different intersections and turning points throughout the data flow in my organization.
Hmm.
that there is not one end-to-end test. I have to always look at, okay, where does this business flow go? Where does the other business flow go? And maybe this one goes to a different payment provider because we're in a different region, and that's what it makes it quite challenging in reality to have an end-to-end suite that really covers your most important aspects.
And it sounds like the person who works with some of this stuff needs to have that uh, holistic knowledge across the board to know where to look for certain things.
Yeah, I mean, I feel whenever we come in and set up a new end-to-end suite or improve an existing one, it's a
Hmm.
bit of an archaeologist's work. So we go into very old documentation. We
Yeah.
also need to talk to a lot of people to really find out, hey, how are things playing together? Or
Hmm.
even how do people think they're playing together? It wouldn't be the first time that we figure out that something works completely different than documented or than some people think on the front end what the back end is doing.
Yeah.
It's always a treasure chest of excitement of what we're going to find in a large end-to-end system.
That's what makes it exciting, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And so obviously you've mentioned how challenging it can be and complex. I'm curious to understand what the most common hidden assumption is that you see within these uh, enterprise end-to-end suites.
I think, most people go in with a very good idea of we know how our production data is looking and it is clean and we just write some tests with the
Hmm.
perfect inputs and valid addresses and properly formatted names and no special characters and no user errors. But in reality, production is messy. And if your
Hmm.
end-to-end test suite doesn't test the dirty data or this messiness, it's not testing reality. So if we have time for one example, we once had a system crash
Yeah.
because a user pasted an emoji into a last name field. That was a character no one expected. Front end didn't catch it. It
Hmm.
went all the way through to the backend, but then our finance systems could not really process it. So let's not test with just simple names with Smith and Doe. Consider people with other languages. They have completely different character sets, but also consider timing issue. Consider that your system runs at different time points throughout the world. Maybe you have um, a batch job running at midnight in your time zone, and that's perfect. But that might be in the main business time in another part of the globe, and that's all something we need to consider. Production is not beautiful. Production is messy, and production is the real world. And we shouldn't be testing a fantasy. We should be testing the software how it's really getting used.
100% agree with that, actually. Yeah, it is very true because production reflects what I mean, every single use case or potential scenario that you would get. So that's
Right.
exactly what you need to be testing in the first place. And like I mean, we say this especially when we're working with data, right? Garbage in, garbage out. So it's a valid point. Dirty data is definitely where the bugs actually live. And speaking of this, then, time for an end-to-end confession. What's one test then that you trusted for way too long, only to realize it was completely misleading?
Oh, that's a tough one.
Have there
So,
been that many?
yeah, oh yes, there have been that many. But there is one project, and it's been many years ago, so I think I can confess about that one.
Uh-huh.
Um, it, we had to check a workout flow, and of course, you always test all different kinds of vouchers and payment providers. And we also use the test credit number. The problem is this test credit card number that we used bypassed the fraud detection service entirely. So we
Oh,
released, and some of the real credit cards
yeah.
hit the fraud service and failed immediately. So I was in fact not testing the fraud service. I was just testing the bypass and not the payment. That
Mm.
was a costly mistake. Luckily, we got it patched within a few hours before the real big user numbers ran into that.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. Painful, but definitely sounds like a valuable lesson there. And switching gears a bit. So, what's a moment where test results changed a critical decision? look at it from the other angle.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I always hope that my test results are a good base for critical decisions.
Mm-hmm.
And I see end-to-end results often as a negotiation tool because you can bring them in to force decisions on readiness without just relying on opinions.
Mm-hmm.
And going back to one retail example, and everyone working in retail knows all year is chill, but if Black Friday is coming, your system better work, otherwise you have a problem.
Yeah.
And once we had to delay a Black Friday release because our end-to-end data showed that we had a 2% checkout failure rate.
Oh,
And those are numbers that are much stronger than someone saying, "Oh, I feel ready," or businesses, "Oh, this looks good." But if I look at the data and I see a 2% checkout failure rate, that's not great in front of Black Friday.
no.
So we've been on a war room call. It was a very tense room, and you had the marketing director specifically very worried that they're going to miss the holiday window.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, I didn't tell them, look, the Selenium script failed. They would not have cared about that.
Yeah.
But what I told them is like, if we launch now, 2 out of every 100 customers will click pay and nothing will happen. Are we okay with losing that revenue?
Yeah.
And just like this, if you ask the question that way, there is no one seeing test as a blocker anymore. Everyone is happy we found it, and the question becomes, how do we fix this revenue leak? And I think this is the true data that we can get out of end to end. This is what helps us make real decisions, not just feeling, oh, I think, this looks good, but really
Mm-hmm.
saying we have a checkout flow that's robust. There will not be big issues in production if we go with that.
Yeah. 100% agree. And I mean, in the grand scheme of things, you think about it and you think 2% chance, right? And you think, oh, that doesn't sound like too much. But when you put it into perspective, right? Black Friday, especially, every two in 100, that's quite a lot.
Yeah,
So,
and if you put a dollar value behind it, like if you say I have maybe a checkout volume of 400K in an hour,
mhm,
that adds up really quickly. So I want these bugs fixed as soon as possible.
yeah. And I think what's really crucial here is knowing your audience, right? So how to frame that. So yeah, I can see where you come at it from when you say negotiation tool. As for the end-to-end results, I feel like they can sometimes feel like blame reports. So how would you present them without turning it into a finger pointing or a blame game session?
I mean, there is one thing that's inherent to all end-to-end bugs, or almost all of them, is that people are not always sure from the beginning on who is to blame. Like, is
Yes.
it in this system? Is it in that system? And if it's in that system, who's to blame on that? I don't want to focus on ownership. I
Hmm.
focus on the risk. For me, the message is not like your service fails. I'm more like, hey, the system behaves like this. If I do that, is that acceptable to everyone here?
Hmm.
And then we turn this around, discuss the business risk. And maybe, people say, actually, this really doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things. People can still check out if we stay with our retail example. So let's move on with this release. But that becomes a much more collaborative discussion than, pointing the finger at someone saying there is a bug in your system. Yeah,
Hmm.
it's about an end-to-end effort. In the end, we all have the same goal to get the running system out there. And
Hmm.
if just one little gear of the system doesn't work, it doesn't help pointing at that gear. Your system still doesn't work. So everyone needs to make sure we do what we can to get that gear running. And more than once, I had the case that we found, okay, that bug lives in this one system.
Hmm.
But now that we are, under release pressure, maybe it makes sense to fix it in a different system just because the fix is gonna be more stable and faster, and then we patch the system with the actual problem later.
Right.
You need to be a bit flexible there, and that's where we come back to my negotiation topic. So everything on end-to-end testing is communication and negotiation.
Hmm. Yeah, I can see how that's really important here. And just going back onto the team dynamics topic, right? You briefly touched on it. Where's the line between quality advocate and release blocker?
Oh, I am both. So if you hear me on a call on release day,
Yeah,
I'm a blocker because I'm there because my test data shows something critical is still not working. So
right.
there, I have no problem being the blocker.
Hmm.
Um, but if I'm there during implementation and design, and that's 99% of my time, I'm
Hmm.
an advocate. I'm trying to help developers catch bugs before the gate, you
Yes.
know? So try to be an advocate whenever possible. Sometimes you might need to be a blocker, but you're blocking with a good reason, and you have to explain this reason to people why you're blocking.
Yeah. It's got to be in those critical scenarios where you think, okay, there could be some serious damage if I'm not a blocker here.
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah. And then what's your rule in end-to-end testing? So I mean, for when you call a real third party versus when you're actually simulating it.
That's very simple for me. I look at my critical path, and if the third party is on the critical path for my revenue,
Yeah.
then we test against their sandbox. I'm not doing any simulation, I'm not doing any stops. I have to say we need to get access to that sandbox of this provider, and we
Mm-hmm.
test it maybe in nightly runs, but this is something that is non-negotiable for me. And for example, this is exactly when we go back to my one confession about the payment gateway.
Yes.
Payment gateways, this is something I'll test against the sandbox of the payment provider. I do
Mm-hmm.
not simulate that. I do not use mocks or stubs or anything like that.
No, you need the real thing there.
Mhm.
Uh, so when we talk about third parties then and potential failures, do you have some repeat failures that you tend to always simulate in any scenario?
Yeah, I mean, there's some stuff that you can only simulate. And what I always try to simulate is timeout and slow responses.
Mm-hmm.
Because, everyone thinking of heart failures, but to be honest, heart failures are easy to handle. You will find those very early in your testing.
Okay.
But if we have some slow response where the API is hanging for, let's say, 29 seconds and then fails, this
Mm-hmm.
locks up your full application thread. You have your user sitting, watching the clock ticking, and maybe even abandoning the card or move to a competitor. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm looking very much to timeouts and slow responses, and this is very difficult to test. So it's usually a collaborative effort where we try to simulate how do we get the timeout really there, or how do we really get to a slow response.
Yeah, and these are of course common scenarios you would have, like for example, like you highlighted earlier, Black Friday or peak periods, and you
Mhm.
need to have something in place for that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Okay then. So time to stir the pot a bit, right? Tell me, when someone insists only UI tests matter, what's your go-to response?
I mean, UI tests do matter. And I mean, they check the display, and we should do that because that's what our users click. But if we look at our system, 90% of the complexity, the pricing logic, the inventory reservation, the fraud check, all of that is happening in APIs, in microservice, or somewhere under the hood.
Mm-hmm.
And those are the things I really want to have working. So I focus also most of my time in end-to-end testing on those layers. I'm not
Right.
saying don't test UI tests. You should still do that.
Yeah.
But it's not the only thing that matters for sure.
Yeah. It's a combination, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And obviously you mentioned testing testing the UI is important. I'm just curious, do you have any cases where you insist on the UI end-to-end testing, or for example, when you uh, have an inkling, for example, that you can refuse it?
Yeah, I mean, it always comes back to the critical user journeys. I think critical user journeys should also happen in end-to-end on the front end. use the UI for that. But as soon as you go into any kind of combinations or lots of data, do that in the unit or API layer. So for example, if I need to calculate the tax for 50 different states and I want to validate that, I don't need to do this in the front end. Let's do that in the app layer. Let's see if it's all calculated right, and then just do one or two checks on the front end and not for all possible combinations.
I see. Okay. Okay. And you mentioned, just going back to something that you mentioned earlier then, right? You said end to end is a bit of a story that we tell ourselves. Is the only answer to that then testing in production? Because that's where you see most of the, let's say, bad data.
Yeah. I mean, testing in production is maybe not the only answer, but it's a good additional strategy.
Hmm.
And to be honest, I'm shocked of how little it's been done in
Yeah.
the whole business. And of course, I don't mean literally testing in production. I'm still a big fan of structured tests, of staged environments, quality gates. But I think when I talk about testing in production, is like we should try to somehow limit the blast radius of bugs that we couldn't catch in those earlier stages. So we
Hmm.
should be using feature flags, and we should have some very tight observability in place to really check what's happening in production.
I see. Okay. And are there certain things that you measure first here, like for example, business KPIs, latency, etc.?
Business KPIs. So absolutely, if I see the checkouts dropping to zero, I don't care if the latency is fine. It
Yeah.
doesn't help us. Or if the error logs are clean, we see that the business is bleeding, and we start with the money and then work backwards to the tech or the system that we think is the culprit.
Hmm.
And I think this is also a mindset change that you need to instill in some of the more old school testers, is
Yeah.
that you really look what's happening on production, try to simulate what the user does, try to follow what they're doing, get access to the real logs, get access to the business KPIs, and
Hmm.
then set your tests up accordingly. And I think
Okay.
you can set them up, as very, very small, safe experiments.
Right. And what would you say then is the smallest safe experiment you could run in prod without causing chaos?
Mhm. Um, hmm. I think the smallest thing is like just put the feature behind the flag. Put the release a feature flag there and make it only accessible to your testers or to your employees or to your developers or to your own support tests. Let them use this in production before real customers see it. And again, I have to say this is a very simple answer. It's not
Mhm.
rocket science, but it's not being done consistently. And yeah, I'm a big proponent of feature flags. I think without them nowadays in complex system, you're just gonna lose sooner or later.
So are we talking about testing hundreds of feature flags then?
Oh, well, I mean, yes and no. I mean, feature flags need to be part of the strategy. That there is a
Yeah.
risk there, how I combine them, and I need to test the full flag lifecycle itself, turning it on, turning it off, rolling it back, and also ensuring that stale flags are being removed.
Hmm. Okay. I'm just wondering, like when we talk about so many feature flags then, right? How would we prevent this from almost exploding in terms of the test scope?
Yeah. See, this is, I basically see two large groups of systems. Like one group doesn't even use feature flags at all, so there's a
Hmm.
problem. And they see the other half is using them wrong. I
Um,
see a lot of systems that accumulate those feature flags.
mhm.
They never delete them. And I think a flag should live just for a few days or weeks until you've proven that that feature really works. And then I need to aggressively delete that flag, get this feature flag out of the system. And
Right.
if you look into your system dashboard and you have 50 active flags, you do not have a testing problem. You do have a management problem because no one there to say, hey, those feature flags can go out now. Those features are live in production since month. Nothing bad will happen. We will never deactivate them. So let's get rid of that. But this needs to happen. Otherwise, you're right. I have an exploding test scope and I cannot cover all this.
100%. So the message I'm getting is housekeeping. Stay on top of it. Okay.
Absolutely right.
Great. Okay, thank you for that. And now what I need you to do is a look into the crystal ball, right? So looking ahead, how do you see the future of enterprise end-to-end testing evolving, given the advancements in AI, machine learning, and low-code, no-code testing tools?
Yeah. I think it's already changing a lot, and I think we are moving from scripted paths and fixed test script to more like goal-oriented agents, where we just tell the AI, hey, try to buy a shoe with a discount code, and the AI should figure out the navigation, should find the path and the bugs. We didn't even think about it because they can try so many more combinations than you would set the human tester there, especially if
True.
they work 24/7, hundreds of agents at the same time. And right now, I see, in end-to-end testing, 80% of our time is maintaining some scripts that break when a selector changes or when there's test data missing. And in the future, AI won't care about the selectors. It will look at the screen like a human does. And
Yeah.
it will not care if it has to, control a web front end or if it has to control an ERP backend. It just can access those as if it was a human. And it can also create the test data if it's gone and invented. So I think, the job that we have as testers is changing. I don't think we'll be writing that much code anymore to find elements. And I think we'll be more like engineering those agents to act like our most confused, most chaotic users. And in the end, every tester will become kind of a test manager with hundreds of test agents to manage. Not sure how this will work yet, but I'm excited about it.
Yeah, definitely. It sounds exciting, right? Flipping the scripts almost. So, yeah, okay, great. And before we wrap up then, Christian, any advice that you want to leave our audience with today?
Quality is communication, especially in end-to-end testing. So stop trying to automate everything, but just try to explain and discuss results a little better. It's really worth the investment of time.
Definitely. And that was shown in the example you shared with us earlier. So 100% agree with that. Thanks so much, Christian, for sharing your insights today. And that's a wrap for today's episode. So again, a huge thanks to Christian for sharing the insights, real world wisdom about the tricky world of end-to-end testing. And to our listeners, whether you're debugging your tests or just debugging your coffee routine, we appreciate you tuning in. Stay curious, keep questioning, and join us next time on the Quality Beat for another deep dive into software testing that matters.